Leadership development. Why is it important to so many pastors, yet why are so few churches prioritizing it? My guest today, Ronnie Martin, is the Director of Leader Care and Renewal for Habrob Network and the pastor in residence for Redeemer Bloomington Church in Indiana. And today we're going to talk about leadership development.
Hey, we just need somebody so bad. We're just desperate because we're experiencing growth, but it's outpacing our ability to train or grow leaders.
Ronnie's going to share today about why everyone knows how important leadership development is, and yet it so often gets pushed to next year.
Relax. You need to calm yourself before the Lord. You need to face your fears. You need to reach out to some people. You need to get some involvement in this so that you don't feel so alone. And it's okay. Take some time. Don't start hurrying.
You're going to want to stay to the end because Ronnie's going to share 4 simple steps that you can take to get started with leadership development at your church right now. So let's get into it. Ronnie, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So Ronnie, why don't you give us just a little bit of background on you, just a little bit of your backstory and just your involvement just as a pastor and also your involvement with Habrob Network.
Yeah, gosh. So been doing pastoral ministry of some shape or form for 20 plus years. Relocated from Southern California where I got my start in ministry 15 years ago. And then I ended up in Ohio where planted a couple of churches while I was out there. I was the lead pastor for 12 years, got involved with Habrob Network during that time of planting. And so they were just one of the networks that we just kind of got close to and partnered with as we were trying to figure out everything that we were doing in the planting world. And before I knew it, I just started doing some pastoral care work for them, my wife and I. And then after just a number of years, there was an opportunity just to go full time with them. And we just really felt like the Lord was opening those doors. And so we took the step last year at this time, step in full time. And that's what we've been doing ever since. And then relocated from Ohio to, as you stated earlier, Bloomington, Indiana. And then took just a very part-time role as pastor in residence at Redeemer Bloomington, where I just do preaching and teaching. So, yeah.
That's awesome. So, I mean, you've seen leadership development from both as a pastor, but also from a network perspective, supporting other pastors.
Yeah.
And I always say being a pastor must be the hardest job there is. And I bet you have insight on that way beyond my experience. What have you seen about what's the role of pastor look like in this era?
Well, yeah, gosh, it's definitely one of the hardest jobs there is, I think. And I think when you kind of combine it now with kind of the world we're living in post-pandemic, there's just pastors just faced a lot of pressure during that time. And it's kind of shaped where a lot of guys are at right now, just in terms of it surfaced a lot of things. It surfaced a lot of fears, and it surfaced a lot of tensions and unrest and things that just kind of boiled over in our churches. And it put a lot of pastors in positions where they weren't sure they could really go on, or that they wanted to keep kind of like doing what they were doing, or, they were wondering, man, am I somebody that I feel like at some point I was called to do this, but this whole thing has gone haywire. Yeah. And I'm being called to think about things and speak into things that I didn't get any training in. And so I think right now we're coming out of that a little bit, but it shaped things quite a bit. I think pastors are in just kind of fragile places right now, and they want to continue to be faithful. They want to continue to do the work that they feel like they've been called to do. But it feels very fraught with danger at times now. And so I would say that's one of the big things that's sort of in the mix. Yeah.
Yeah. I recently read a study. The Barna Group was looking at pastors and just the intent to quit, for lack of a better term, but found over they did a couple years right in a row asking how many seriously thought about leaving ministry in the past 12 months, and it went from 27% to over 40% in a just looking year over year. And I'd be interested to hear from your perspective, like when you see pastors needing care and renewal, what are some of the the kind of the main drivers? What are some of the big themes that you've seen?
Yeah, I think, that probably hasn't changed much over the years. I think pastors are seeking safe places to be heard, and just to be listened to, and a place to just maybe express some of those feelings, some of those emotions, to be able to kind of share some of the things that they've gone through. And so for me, my role in this network is it's doing just that. It's just giving those guys, lending them my ear is how I like to put it, and just saying, hey, this is a safe place. You can tell me anything you got, and it can be as raw as it needs to be, and I'm just here to listen and let you know you're not crazy, and let you know that Jesus loves you, and that none of this is a surprise to him. And hey, are there some things that we can maybe look at and be reminded of, in terms of the care that God has for us, and how these things can be encouraging for us in terms of just staying the course, being faithful, and not giving up so maybe so quickly or so easily, but developing endurance through what maybe has been some difficult times.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I just had a chance to hear Paul Tripp speak this past week, and he was talking about just God giving us the gift of an un. It was like what was the exact word he used? It was just like just the fact that sometimes trial, tribulation, that's part of our opportunity to really lean on Him in humility, and to really get to know Him in in a new way, just even through trials, and not not just like everything's not all good and easy and all those kinds of things. I'm sure for pastors though, that could be really hard at times to even as pastors to feel that.
Well, it's just, it's such an interesting job in that, here you are, you're shepherding people, you're walking with them through their dark seasons, their difficult times, and yet you're somebody that's having dark seasons and difficult times. And so there's such a pouring out that happens with pastors. And what most of them don't have is anybody pouring into them. And so that's something that's something that always needs to be addressed with pastors is, hey, do you have a friend? Do you have somebody that is close, that is a confidant, that listens to you, that is pouring into your life, that is refilling your tank, so to speak. And so that's just a really crucial thing, definitely for pastors. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it speaks a lot to Habrob Network that they've dedicated so much focus to this, in terms of just pastor renewal, pastor care.
Yeah.
So maybe just be helpful to just hear a little bit about Habrob Network, maybe just a little bit of background there, and what the organization's calling and mission is, and kind of how it's supporting pastors, but also churches within the network.
Yeah, so Habrob's been around since 2011, and as a church planting network, but we really consider ourselves what we call a renewal network, and really behind that is just this desire to want to see pastors and leaders and churches just flourish in ministry. And so that's how we direct our efforts, and so we use the name of the network is Habrob Network, and we use that as sort of this visual to really kind of understand what our mission is. And when you think of a harbor, you think of ships kind of coming from the open sea into the harbor, right, to make sure that their ship is getting attended to, make sure that they are getting attended to, they're getting off the boat, they're coming onto the dock, they're caring for themselves. But a harbor is not meant to just house ships perpetually. It's meant to send ships out back to the sea. And so this idea of a harbor that takes in those ships and then sends them back out, stronger, well-rested, renewed, and ready to get back out into the work of the ministry. That's just a little bit of a visual for kind of how we see what we do, which is just, again, caring for leaders. We also plant churches, but we are just committed to planting churches with men and with women that are experiencing that kind of renewal, so that they're actually in a healthy place when they're planting those churches, so that, again, we use the word flourishing a lot, so that they're flourishing into the future. And of course, all of this is, we know how difficult ministry is. we know how difficult church planting is. So none of this is, of course, trying to achieve any kind of utopian perfection. It's just to say, hey, we really value what's going on internally. We really value what God's doing in the hearts of leaders. And we just want to make sure that we're doing the right things to cultivate those good things, so that kind of what you stated earlier with those Barna stats, that people aren't just dying. They're not dying on the vine, so to speak. And so that's what we're committed to, is just healthy pastors, thriving churches, flourishing leaders.
Yeah, I love that. I love that metaphor of the harbor, and the, just the recognition that it's a safe place, and it's renewal and refresh. But like, then, okay, but the goal is to be back out there. I love that. I love that. So I really wanted to zoom in today and maybe double click on leadership development. One thing I've found since I wrote the book, The Nehemiah Way, and since I've been meeting with a lot of pastors and speaking in groups of pastors, the topic that keeps coming up in these conversations is leadership development. And you and I have had a lot of discussions about that as well. I'd just love to hear your perspective on, number one, why is it top of mind for everyone? But also, I'm hearing a lot of, I know we need to do that someday, but maybe next year. It's like, that keeps getting pushed off. So, just interested in your thoughts. Why this is top of mind, and why is it still often get kind of pushed to the side?
It's a great question. And I don't know if, we all know that, certain like ministry principles, they kind of go in cycles. And maybe this was something that if you go back 20 years, it was being talked about more than it is now. And now it's circling back around to a new generation of pastors that are like, I got, this is all I'm thinking about. I'm looking around at all these different ministries, and I'm thinking about the leaders that we need to lead these ministries. And they're not just sort of, they're not sort of just coming out of thin air. They're not just sort of presenting themselves fully trained and ready to, kind of embark and lead out on these ministries. So there could be something with just seeing kind of some of the leadership crises that we've had and seen over the past X number of years, and just kind of being alerted to that and saying, hey, maybe this was in some ways, maybe this is a leadership development crisis that we're experiencing, because sometimes we put people into leadership roles that aren't ready. And then we see how things can go badly when that happens. And so, gosh, how do I develop leaders, and what are some of the methods that I need to do? And I think, to the second part of your question, not treating it like it's just sort of like this program I can pull off the shelf, as much as it needs to be something that kind of encompasses who we are as a church organization, which is like, we're a church that, like, this is intrinsic to who we are. This is part and parcel of who we are, rather than it just being something that is just one element that we do at the church. I would say that when I talk to leaders, that you're right when you say that's coming up a lot. It's being talked about a lot. And again, I don't know if it's something with this emerging generation, or something even people that are my age that are looking back at the last 10 years going, hey, we really missed this. But it's important enough that we recognize it, we acknowledge it, and we want to turn the ship around, so to speak, in this particular category.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about next generation, because I know a lot of talk right now in the conferences I've been at this year have talked about Gen Z and ministering to Gen Z, reaching out to Gen Z. The church in general, there's kind of an aging happening and de-churching and some of these kinds of things. What are things you've seen that have been successful in terms of leadership development, or maybe what are some of the ideas out there about how to be more engaging with younger people that are thinking about being in ministry, or even just being active as lay leaders within their church?
Yeah. So, I would be, so my generation, I'm part of the Gen X, thing. And I think what I grew up with was, just more of a sense of top-down leadership. So you had either the one guy, or you had the group of professionals, and you just were kind. And again, this is going to sound like cynical Gen X coming out, right? I don't mean it to.
You're good company here, so
right, yeah. But it was much more of the sense of, when am I going to get my chance to sort of like kind of come up into that group of leaders, and are you ever going to give me the opportunity? Are you ever going to pull me up into into this group of men where I then can have the opportunity and the chance to lead. And I never like to generalize too much, but I think the generation that came before me wasn't as good at doing that as maybe subsequent generations have been, or at least they weren't aware that they needed to do that, because it was very much like you had a leader, you had a strong leader type, or you had a boss.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm seeing now with younger leaders, which is probably a healthier approach, it's different. You're seeing more you're seeing more collaboration. So you're seeing this maybe more of a humble leadership approach, which is like, I don't have to be sort of the alpha leader, right? I can be somebody who is drawing people around me, that takes maybe even, a team approach, and sort of even just my mentality and the way I look at things, which is saying, hey, I may be a leader, but I need good leaders surrounding me that have a diversity of gifts, so that we are able to, again, develop a culture that has ministries that are, again, being effective in terms of kingdom growth. But that's not going to happen typically with just one person, kind of always being the one that is kind of at the helm of everything. So I would say that's something that younger generations are much more open to, which is collaboration for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of like, I guess just approaches to leadership development, what are some things you've seen that were effective? And maybe what are some things that haven't really tracked very well?
Well, there's a tension, I think, when we're seeking leaders, and maybe we've developed, a particular kind of, way to do that, some kind of methodology to do that. Um, I think the tension is knowing when a leader is ready, and I think in ministry, what we see is we see two things happening. We either see men and women that are put into leadership roles way too early, because they haven't been given proper development or training. And it could be a situation in a church where, hey, we just need somebody so bad, we're just desperate because we're experiencing growth, but it's outpacing our ability to train or grow leaders. And so, hey, you have a desire to do this, so why don't we just grab you and put you in there, and you'll learn on the job? Which, again, sometimes that can work okay, depending on the ministry, but a lot of times it has long-term, more negative effects. What I experienced on the flip side of that were being with strong leaders who allowed me to, what I would say is, maybe have to wait too long. And so there were times where I felt like, hey, I've been in development and training for quite a while, and I feel like I'm languishing. I feel like I want to get to this place where I'm able to lead out, and I feel like I've been mentored. I've been given some good training, and I feel like there's something fearful in you about kind of letting me go. And so I've seen those two things positively, I think, and negatively. And one of them was kind of negative in my sense, where I felt like one particular leader, that could have been a personality thing for him. But and so, again, because our personalities mix, our personalities in a lot of ways, determine the kind of leader we're going to be. So we got to be really aware of that as well. But yeah, those are two things that come to mind answering your question.
Yeah. Well, I think about kind of I'll call it like kind of worldly leadership perspective, is the two things that matter is somebody's leadership ability and then their ambition to be a leader. And it feels like in any kind of church or ministry perspective, there's this other component of clear calling. And I would maybe even add in, a fourth one being spiritual maturity. Just be interested in your thoughts about those, or, there are others that maybe play in there, other factors that play in.
Yeah, when you said those words, the word discernment came in. And I think this is where we get, when you talk about call and you talk about spiritual maturity and you talk about discernment, those can become, kind of murky areas, for leaders that are wanting to train and develop leaders. And so I always think it's a bit of a tightrope. Calling can be one of these things. We've probably all experienced somebody who has been sort of under our leadership care, and they feel very called to a particular ministry. And maybe we found out as we are training them that they're not naturally gifted for it, or their eagerness to do it has really outpaced like their skill level at doing it. And so it's like, yeah, we love that you're eager, but you're not quite there yet. And so, but we know you feel called to do it. So there's always that you're riding the tension of those things. And I think it's up to leaders who are training leaders to have that kind of spiritual maturity, like you pointed out, have that level of discernment and say, hey, we need to be very careful. Like leadership needs to be as much as we don't want somebody to languish because they have matured and they have developed, and we don't want to put somebody in too quick. We definitely want to always be praying that we have good discernment in terms of, man, somebody who feels like they're called, and we've seen some of those gifts come out. When is the right time, to sort of activate them? And I think that's where things can get a little tricky, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it sounds like, two things. It's the person's actual readiness, but then it's also the readiness of whoever the, kind of presiding leader is to let those that are following them or maybe leading like under their oversight to really get started. What do you think are what are some of like the legitimate reasons for a leader to hold back and turning someone loose versus what are things that maybe it's, you mentioned like there almost needs to be a humility of like turning loose. What are some of the things that come to mind for you in those two areas?
Yeah, I think, I think to your first point, I think just recognizing that maybe there is a lack of maturity. And again, we are always maturing. And, but I think, it's really up to, like, I think you used the word presiding leader to, to hopefully make that determination and not do it in a, not do it in a vacuum either. I think it really takes having other people around to help make that determination. Like, hey, I'm thinking of so-and-so leader, and man, I love the way they're developing. I see some of the fruit that's coming out of their ministry, but there's a few things here that still, I think, I think are still, concerning, or maybe they're not concerning in an overtly negative way, but they just kind of point to this person's level of maturity and discernment. And so I would say until we let him do X, Y, and Z, let's keep watching him for a little while here. But I think the other thing with that is let's talk to him about that, and let's make sure that we're not just, again, we're not discussing those things in a vacuum, but we're having honest conversations with him so that they actually know what areas that, they can experience some growth in. And so I think part of that process is having honest conversations, without crushing the person, but acknowledging their gifts, acknowledging their strengths, and saying, hey, these are some areas of growth. And I think you're doing great. But until we maybe, fully launch you into this area of ministry, like we're thinking about in the future, let's just give it a little more time. Anything worth doing is worth taking time doing right. And, I think just, being slow is always a wise ministry place to be in. And how a person who's being trained reacts to slowness tells you a lot about their level of maturity as well, I think. But
Yeah, that's really good. It feels like this whole conversation where it almost takes us naturally into the theme of succession planning. Can you think of an example of a church that has gone through a transition of maybe a strong pastor that was just in place for a long time, or maybe even started a church, but then, really brought a leadership team and individuals that were ready to kind of carry on even when they were at the end of their time there? Any examples you can think of there?
I wasn't close to it because I wasn't part of this church, but I knew some people there that talked about when Ray Ortland stepped down from Emmanuel in Nashville. It's a church he planted, and he, the pastor there now is a guy named T.J. Timms, great guy. And all I remember just hearing that they took their time doing it. TJ was already in place there, I believe, as an associate pastor. He was doing quite a bit of preaching, and probably I would imagine quite a few leadership things to go alongside of the preaching. But I've heard from so many people that transition went really well, and I think because there was they took their time doing it. People knew exactly what was happening, so there was open communication with the congregation. And it just sounds like at some point Ray was able to let go and relinquish those things to TJ so that he could assume the role. And it doesn't always go great. I've also heard about less well-known succession plans where it seemed like they did everything. They checked all the boxes, and yet it just didn't go that great. And a lot of that is due to, people not being able to receive somebody new and let go some, of an older beloved, pastor. So I think we always do our best to do everything we can in those scenarios. And we have to trust the Lord, because try as we might, we check all the right boxes, and yet it still doesn't go as smoothly as we had hoped. So very difficult.
Yeah. So let's talk about the differences between staff leaders, so individuals that are paid to take on leadership roles in the church, and then lay leaders, those that are, members of the church, actively involved with the ministry, stepping into leadership roles. How do you see some of the differences and similarities? Are there any between those types of scenarios where someone's in a kind of a paid staff leadership role versus someone who's a lay leader taking on a role as a lay leader?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think it really depends on the structure of the church. The churches we planted, these were, small to medium sized churches. They're all under 400 people, and so we really had to depend on a volunteer leadership team to do probably half the work that we needed to get done. And so we had a small staff, and then we had a whole deacon ministry where people were just lay leaders and they would volunteer. I definitely think there's a difference. I definitely think for people that are part of paid staff, there's definitely a different expectation in place there, because this is what they do for a full time. They do it full time, and they have the time to develop their ministries and to focus on them and to spend all the hours they need during the week to do that and to build teams and all those types of things. I think one of the biggest differences, and this is where churches get into trouble, is almost treating their volunteer staffs like paid staff, because these are people that typically work full-time jobs. They're doing these ministry roles in the margins. And so I think something really vital and important that a church paid staff can do is make sure that, a volunteer staff, deacons, that they have really, they have a very clear job description of what it is that they're going to do. And it's been narrowed down as much as possible so that they can do it while they're doing all the other things that they do, in terms of their full-time job. So I definitely think there needs to be sort of a little bit of a difference in roles, to where there needs to be a narrowing down for volunteer staff. Here's what we just need you to do. Paid staff's going to take care of some of the stuff that you won't have time to do. But if you can just step in and do this, and we can train you to do this, and you feel called to do this, all the things we've been talking about, I think we'll be okay. But there has to be a distinction, right? So, yeah.
So talk a little bit about that training process. What does that look like? What does that look like for paid staff leaders? What does it look like for volunteer leaders? What does leadership development look like broadly in a church setting?
Yeah, well, I think the way that we try, I'll kind of focus on volunteer staff. The way that we tried to focus on it, especially because we had such a large deacon staff, volunteer staff. And really, our methodology was fairly simple, which would be when it was time for a deacon who was in a particular role, let's just say we had a deacon of hospitality at our church. So I'll use them as an example. And they were in charge of. We did a ton of meals, And we did a ton of food services, and we had a cafe, and we had all these types of things that our hospitality deacon was over. And it was always when they were reaching sort of the end of their time, where they were feeling like, hey, I've been serving here for a year, or I've been, in this role for long enough to where I feel like it's time for me to move on. It was always, well, hey, have you located anybody? Is there anybody that's been helping you that you've assembled in terms of your volunteer staff? Is there anybody that sticks out for you as somebody that can maybe lead this? There usually was. And then we would sit down with that person. We would say, well, what are some of the things you could do after maybe they've agreed to take over your role, that you can kind of be a little more intentional in training and preparing them to kind of step in? So it was almost just like a handing off process of the role, kind of taking what you've learned, and then handing it off to the next person, but then having a paid staff person, kind of preside over that and oversee that and make sure that the person that was handing off had what they needed, the tools, and then the new person coming in had the tools that they needed. I think what you're always trying to get to is, what are the expectations? And am I providing clarity in terms of what those expectations are? Most people flounder because they don't know what they're supposed to do. They want to do it. They don't know what they're supposed to do. And the expectations haven't been made clear, and the actual tasks, aren't incredibly clear. And I think the work that we can do to provide clarity is kindness. The line, clarity is kindness, and that's what we're trying to provide. Within that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you saying things like, clear role descriptions and expectations, just, clarity of like, what the outcomes look like. I hear, talking about, broadly talked about succession planning, like, having those you're developing further, whether it's through training or coaching, having them up, really in that ready position for, who's going to take over, who's going to come up next.
Yeah.
So, you've shared with me, I'd love to just hear if someone's sitting there thinking, if a pastor's watching this and thinking, I know leadership developments at my church. I know for the last 3 or 4 years, I've said next year we're going to do this, and it keeps getting we're kicking the can down the road. What are those 4 simple steps to just get started? What would be, if you were going to walk us through, like, somebody says, where do I even begin?
Yeah. Well, whenever it's time to begin something that we feel uncomfortable with, we're usually facing some kind of paralysis, right? And so I would say the first thing we want to do is just face our fear with it. Things that we're not oriented, things that we haven't become oriented with, can feel confusing. They can feel overwhelming. And I think it's okay to just say, hey, I feel, excuse me, I feel a little overwhelmed about what leadership development even is, or I know a little bit something about it. Maybe I've read about it, but it feels daunting. And so I think just to acknowledge that, hey, nobody's asking you to be a leadership development guru right out of the gate. Just acknowledge that, hey, you have some limitations, and you have some fears about it, and it's something that needs to be part and parcel of your ministry. I think just allowing the Lord to calm your soul, bring you to a place of peace. And it's always a good first step to be humble about something and say, I'm not really sure where to begin or how to begin. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say reach out to others. Get other people who are further along than you involved. And that's a very humble thing for a lot of us, just to be able to maybe go to, maybe if you're a pastor, maybe it's seeing another church in town and saying, man, they seem to really have their leadership development process a lot further along than we are. I'd love to go get a cup of coffee and ask this person how they're doing it. What are they doing? Or, don't be afraid to get involved in a cohort or in a group where you can just start learning about this. Sometimes we feel the tyranny of the urgent. We feel like, oh, I got to do this now. I should have done it yesterday, which means I need to do it in 10 minutes. And it's like, no, you don't. You need to just relax. You need to calm yourself before the Lord. You need to face your fears. You need to reach out to some people. You need to get some involvement in this so that you don't feel so alone. And it's okay. Take some time. Don't start hurrying. but get into more of a hushed place between, your heart and the Lord, and see what he does. I think number three, it's letting your church know. It's making it more of a group project. It's basically saying, hey, church, one of the things that we would like to step into, because maybe we've been neglecting it and we want to acknowledge that, is we want us to be a church that's that is known for developing leaders. We have all these different ways and ideas and maybe visions of how the church can serve one another in the community, but we actually have to have leaders to do that. And that means we have to develop leaders, right? They don't just come out of thin air typically. And so I think making the church aware and letting them know that they are going to have a part in this process, it also then allows you to not feel like you're alone and you got to figure everything out and you got to be the guru. But it allows the church to come in and make it a collaborative project. And I think that's what you want. And then I think the fourth thing is, don't wait too long to get it started. Start messy. Let it be messy. I'm always an advocate of don't be sloppy. Like, don't start things when nothing's ready to go. Right. That's like eating like eating an uncooked meal. It's like, don't do that. Cook the meal. But the table doesn't have to be set to perfection before you serve it. And so I'm all about, hey, we've spent some time looking at this, planning this, figuring some things out. Why don't we start activating some of these things a little bit? Let's start giving it a try. Again, due diligence is always a good thing. And but let's not wait forever. Let's not let it get into a place of where we get up to the point and then there's no execution, because that can happen a lot in ministries too. So face our fears, reach out to others, let your church get involved as a group project, and start messy and see what the Lord does with those efforts.
I love that. I love that. Start messy, not sloppy. That's that so gritty. That makes me think of Nehemiah in the sense of, when he arrives, it's like 3 days of kind of getting everybody, getting ready and then getting everybody on board and then go. But at the same time, when you look, it's like, so it was definitely a messy start, but it was not sloppy, months and months of prayer, preparation, planning, getting everything ready. But not like spending years getting it perfect. Like, let's just get started and then, leading in motion and, mobilizing in motion.
Yeah, that's it.
I love that. So one of the things this has been such a great conversation. I kind of feel like we could just keep going on for hours when it comes to leadership development. There's so many things to think about, but I really feel like this is so practical. It's just, it just seems like something that every church feels like there's more they could do, even those that are doing it really well. And those that feel like, oh, where do I start? I think some really, really good practical ways to do that. So I just really appreciate you being here and being able to talk about this. Before we go, I always like to ask the question, what is, if in just times you've read the book of Nehemiah, what's your favorite Nehemiah moment?
Oh, man. I love that. I love that when they're working on the wall and they get just that resistance. They get that resistance from the enemies that are taunting them and wanting them to stop the progress. And I love that Nehemiah just doesn't even put up with it for a second, and he just addresses the problems. And I feel like in my own life, I can struggle sometimes with confrontation. Sometimes it scares me, and I've gotten better at that over the Lord. It's an area the Lord has given me some growth in. But I love how Nehemiah he addressed the resistance, and he took care of it, and he did it in a very strong way, and progress was able to continue. And I see that, and that's a personal thing for me, And it's something I really admire about Nehemiah when I'm reading through that. But that part always, and I remember I preached through the book of Nehemiah a few years ago, and I remember getting to that I can't remember where exactly in the book it comes, but I remember just loving the way he responded. And I think that's part of leadership development too, is when we're in that execution process, we're gonna come against things that are resistant to the work that we're trying to do. And part of being a good leader is addressing the problems, and so that the work can continue. There's always a time to take a pause too. Sometimes we have forced pauses, but to not let people that are trying to tear something good down kind of win out is really important for us. So,
yeah, I love that. That's awesome. So, Ronnie, if somebody's watching this and would like to just interact with you or get in contact with you, what are some ways they could link up with you or get involved with the ministry work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to Habrob Network and get info there on how to reach out to me. It's really simple. And then you can get me on social media. Instagram, Twitter, X, Facebook, Threads. So I'm pretty active on there, and real easy to get in touch with me and engage for sure. So
love that. And any special projects or initiatives or things that you're working on right now that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to launch a cohort with Christianity Today magazine this fall called Pursuing an Unhurried Ministry. So that's going to be a 6-week cohort that we're launching this fall. And again, just for pastors that are looking to slow the pace, get out of that frantic way of working, and maybe sort of get a renewed vision for what it looks like to do this work. So yeah,
love that. Well, Ronnie, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate all your insights. This
Absolutely
is great.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here.